Hello, I'm Richard Claus. I'm with the Student Engagement staff in the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department, and I'll be helping Professor Peter Lupu with this Philosophy 101 class. I know it's difficult right now going from an in-person class to some online classes, so what we want to do is create some of these videos, not so much as lectures, but rather as sort of a reading study group. Imagine, if we were all sitting around this table together with the textbook open, looking at the readings that you were having to do for the class, talking about what are the key pieces that we're supposed to see, what are the key concepts, who are the key people. So that's what I envision these videos to be. They're not to be a replacement for your reading, but hopefully a supplement that would be helpful if you had your textbook open. So I'd encourage you, if you have your textbook, grab it in front of you. We'll be using it. You're certainly aware of the Philosopher's Way. You've been using that in your classroom already. And I just want to point something out to you, if you haven't been doing this already. I like this textbook for the wide margins. What they're telling you is that you can take notes there. If you're not doing that, if you're one of those people that don't take notes in your textbook, I would encourage you to start. That's an important thing to do. You're interacting in this textbook and in this class with some of the most influential thinkers and philosophers of all time. You have the right to question them, to ask questions, to challenge their thinking. You're also interacting with the author, Dr. John Chaffee. Professor Chaffee is writing the text as well. You have the right to question and challenge him. And so make this textbook your own, write in the margins, ask any questions, any comments along the way, things that make sense, things that don't make sense. That'll help you so much more as you use this textbook. So if you have your textbook in front of you, I know some of you have the 4th edition, some of you have the 5th. I'm working with the 4th edition, so my page numbers will be the 4th edition. I will attempt to give you the page numbers for the 5th edition, at least at the beginning. So the 4th edition, if you turn to page 506, if you have the 5th edition of the textbook, turn to page 474. We'll start talking about utilitarianism. So 506 in edition number 4, you can see listed there, it says Consequences, Utilitarianism. And we're talking about a moral theory in which actions are judged not by their conformity to rules, such as do not lie or do not murder, but rather the consequences that flow from an action. Right or wrongness is determined by the consequences, not so much by the rules or even the internal attitudes or intentions of the moral person. Because it deals with consequences, this theory is sometimes called consequentialism. It's also, you'll hear this phrase called teleological ethics. And teleological ethics, I know some of you heard and remember the phrase teleological from the philosophy religion section, where you talk about the teleological argument, so the design argument. Here, teleological has a similar function. It has to do with the end or the result. It comes from the Greek word telos, meaning end or result. And so what is the result of one's actions? And that's why it's called a teleological version of ethics. So that helps you. Consequentialism, teleological version of ethics, utilitarianism. You'll notice that on the textbook in 506, both in the text and on the side there are some ancient proponents of utilitarianism, Aristippus and Epicurus. We won't deal with them too much. We are going to deal with 2 other thinkers, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Those are the key names to know associated with utilitarianism. Bentham he liked Epicurus as an ancient philosopher. Matter of fact, he did say this. He says, Epicurus was the only one among the ancients who had the merit of having known the true source of morality. So he tells you what he thought of Epicurus and where he's going with his thinking. So the 2 big names, again, though, for our purposes, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and you can see the dates for them in the textbook themselves. We're talking about the 18th and early 19th centuries, and so there is a movement away from divine revelation. There's a movement away from natural law theories, and there is a desire to look for a scientific basis for ethics. And this comes out most clearly in Jeremy Bentham, his hedonistic calculus. Is there a possibility to have almost a scientific framework to measure the results of an ethical decision and make its determination of its right or wrongness based upon those results? So there's a rejection of divine revelation, natural law, and there's also this desire to have a scientific grounding of ethics, which is what Bentham is attempting to do, and John Stuart Mill will build on that. On page 508 of our textbook, you'll see that it talks about the principle of utility. And perhaps you've heard this principle. Act always to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. act always to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And so many of us have used that reasoning in all sorts of ways. Politicians use it. We're using it right now to determine sometimes, who gets the medicines and where, what cities need most, and how are we going to determine who's going to be most happy, who's going to be most satisfied by the decisions we make. You can see the quotation there in the green box area by Bentham. We won't read all of them all the time, but I do want to read this one because I think this gives us a key into Bentham's thinking. He says this: nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. That's a famous line. You should at least be aware of that. These two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects. Our textbook goes on to note that this actually combines two versions of egoism. What he calls psychological egoism, that we always tend to act out for our desires. When he talks about the chain of reasoning, the cause and effects, we're simply caused to do this. But also, not only is that what is the case, that we happen to do that, but that this is also what we ought to do. So this becomes the moral dimension of it. It's not simply that all of us tend to act this way naturally or for whatever reason. Not only that, we ought to do that. There's a moral oughtness to that. And so this is now ethical egoism as well. There's also an element of determinism in this. And if you thought about that issue or looked at that issue or if that may be coming up in the course. And so Bentham has a deterministic understanding. We're going to act this way. And since we're acting this way, we ought to act this way. This is our sovereign master, pain and pleasure. On page 509, there's some key quotations about happiness. Again, on the green box there, you can see the first paragraph indentation. The principle of utility is the foundation of the present work. It will be proper, therefore, at the outset to give an explicit and determinate account of what is meant by it. He's going to attempt to get what's the definition of it. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the parties whose interest is in question, or what is in the same thing, in other words, to promote or oppose that happiness. So utility is about what's going to promote happiness, and we ought to pursue that which promotes happiness. And so Bentham is looking, as our textbook mentions, for a scientific grounding of these things. Is it possible to simply say, okay, what is the nature of happiness? It's one thing to say, well, we all want happiness. We've probably all experienced something of happiness. But how do you quantify it? How do you begin to package it in sort of a scientific understanding? And this brings us to page 510 in the 4th edition, under that green box called the hedonistic calculus. This is a key point here. And what he attempts to do here is to list out 7 criteria of how we might measure happiness. You can see some of them. It's intensity. Think about any time you've had a happy feeling. Maybe I had some ice cream last night. I was happy eating my ice cream. I can talk about the intensity of it. How intense was the happiness? Its duration. It lasted about 20 minutes. It took me that long to finish my ice cream. Its certainty or uncertainty. How certain was I as I engaged in this, that this was going to actually give me happiness? It was chocolate ice cream. I was fairly certain I would be happy. And its propinquity, or its remoteness, or how near it was to me. Well, it was right in front of me. I knew that immediately I would have this. If I put a spoon in my mouth with the chocolate ice cream on it, it would happen immediately. I'm going to talk about 2 other things. Its fecundity, its chance of being followed by sensations of the same kind, or will this produce other things in me that maybe would be painful to me. I don't like the fact that it tends to put on weight, makes me feel sluggish, and so I have to think about those things. So I'm going to quantify. It's not simply the moment, but what might follow after that, my bowl of ice cream. Its purity, or the chance it has of not being followed by sensations of the opposite kind. So fecundity and purity are sort of related. If it's a pure pleasure, that means there's nothing of negativity that attaches to it. My ice cream was pleasure in the moment, but I also thought about later, it's like, well, this is pretty late when I'm eating the ice cream. It could keep me up. I'm going to have to work out a little harder the next morning, maybe do a little more on the rowing machine, and that's going to be painful. And so it wasn't a pure pleasure, a pure happiness. And the 7th criteria he mentions is the number of persons. If we're going to think about the communal aspects, and so my bowl of ice cream didn't really affect the community, but sometimes my decisions do. And so if I want to drive very fast over the speed limit, 25 miles over the speed limit, perhaps in a school zone, I need to think about the communal aspects of those around me, the children, the crossing guard. And so by these 7 criteria, Bentham's attempting to have us analyze the notion of happiness in a little more detail. So it's not just, oh, I feel happy. What's the nature of that happiness? And according to this, he wants to give an exact account of the act. On page 512, our author points out some basic difficulties. Always watch for that. Every philosophical system has its difficulties. Watch for its weak points. And you can see he lists there, number 1, what counts as a unit of pleasure or pain? When I was first married, my wife would sometimes ask me, how much do you love me? And I would often say to her, 14 gigahertz. And I would often add, and that's the most you can have. Because, right, what's a gigahertz? And how is 14 of them a lot or a little? What's the measurement? If I want to measure this table, for example, we could talk about centimeters or inches or feet. If we want to measure a football field, we might talk about yards or meters. But when we start talking about pleasure, what's the unit of measure? Is it a yard? Is it a pound? How do I measure that? And so Bentham came up with a quantity called a hedon. But people are like, well, what's the nature of that? How big is it? Is it a bushelful? Does it weigh a pound? A ton? What's a hedon? Also notice our author points out that Bentham equates, when he defines happiness, he equates it with pleasure. He'll use synonyms like happiness, good, benefit, advantage. Always watch for how a thinker defines their words and if they shift their terminology over the course of their writing. Simply because something's pleasurable, has he argued that therefore it is morally good? Might there be moral goods that are not pleasurable to pursue but are still good to do? That's a question and a challenge for Bentham and utilitarian ethics in general. You can see also another one. It seems to be, gives maybe a false sense of scientific objectivity. Just because we can lay out criteria, have we really gotten that much closer to analyzing what pleasure is? On page 513 at the very bottom, there's an exercise that the author wants you to do with the box there called Thinking Philosophically. We're not going to go through that exercise, but I did want to point out some of the things that flow from that exercise. Usually when we weigh a moral action, we think about things such as our author says, what is the just and honorable course of action? Or we think about things like, what would a good person do? If a person had a virtuous character, how would they act in this situation? Or what choices would be consistent with maintaining my integrity or my internal virtue? Like I want to be true to who I am or true to my own personal or inner ethics. With utilitarianism, those things, take a back seat. And that's sort of counterintuitive to the way we normally think about how to assess moral situations. For example, the issue of motives on page 514 in the green box area again. Listen to what Bentham says, or if you're following along, read along with me. With respect to goodness and badness, as it is with everything else that is not itself either pain or pleasure, so it is with motives. If they are good or bad, it is only on account of their effects. And later on in the next paragraph indentation, he says this sentence. It appears then that there is no such thing as a sort of motive which is a bad one in itself, nor consequently any such thing as a sort of motive which is itself exclusively a good one. Bentham's arguing there's no such thing as a good motive in and of itself. The only thing that counts, the only thing that makes a motive good is the consequences that flowed from the action. Now, most of us think of that's counterintuitive. Matter of fact, I came across this interesting exercise or illustration from a philosopher, J.P. Moreland. And so I'll list it to you. He pulls out 4 elements, and he's going to mention a motive, intention, the means that a person uses, and the consequence, which is what utilitarians are interested in, consequence. And now listen to this. He mentions, it's a made-up example of Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill go to spend an afternoon with their grandmother. Jack is motivated by love for his grandmother. He intends to show kindness to her by spending the afternoon visiting with her. And as a result, Jack's grandmother is cheered by the company. Jill, on the other hand, is motivated by greed. She intends to secure a place in her grandmother's will by spending an afternoon visiting with her, and Jill is successful in hiding her intentions from her grandmother, and as a result, Jill's grandmother is cheered by the company. Borland goes on to explain and sort of to tease out these four elements. A motive is why one acts. Jack's motive was a feeling of love, and Jill's was greed. That's her motive. An intent is what act one actually performs. The intent answers the question, what sort of act was it? Jack's intent was to show kindness toward his grandmother, and he performed an act of kindness. Jill's intent was to secure a place in the will, and her act was one of attempting to secure that place. The means is the way an agent, or the person, purposely carries out his or her intentions. Jack and Jill each perform the same means. Namely, each spends the afternoon with the grandmother. And finally, the consequences are the states of affairs produced by the act. In each case, the grandmother was cheered up. So for utilitarian, the consequences are exactly the same for the grandmother. And we can assume, perhaps make an assumption that perhaps Jack had some pleasure because he actually expressed his intention of love, in motive of love. And we can perhaps also put into our example that Jill expressed and had pleasure in expressing, her intention and motives, and she got away with it, so to speak. We analyze that situation, and the utilitarian would say, well, since the consequences are the same, both actions are right. And yet, it leaves out the entirety of intention and motives, even though the means and the consequences are the same. So something seems to be missing with utilitarianism. That's something to think about for next time. Next time we'll pick up with John Stuart Mill, and we'll see what he thinks and what he adds to Bentham's understanding of utilitarian ethics. Thank you very much.